The town of Red Creek, Montana Territory, lay like a scar across the plains, rough, wind-bitten, and filled with the kind of folks who measured a man by his grit more than his gentleness. Dust rolled down Main Street every afternoon, and the sound of the blacksmith's hammer kept time with the beat of hard lives lived and lost. Sheriff Colt Maddox rode through the heart of that town like a ghost on horseback. Tall, lean, and built from bone and silence, he was the kind of man who carried his past like a loaded gun, never out of reach, never forgotten. He'd seen too much of men's worst, and after a decade wearing the tin star, love had long been bled out of him. Then one cold autumn morning, the preacher of Red Creek fell ill. Reverend Thomas Dawson, old and frail, had been the one soul Colt ever allowed close to his conscience. The man had baptized him, buried his kin, and prayed over his many sins. When word came that the Reverend was dying, Colt rode to the parsonage without hesitation. He found the preacher on his deathbed, whispering through fever. Beside him sat his daughter, Clara Dawson, the shyest woman in Red Creek. Her hands were folded in her lap, eyes downcast beneath a bonnet of faded blue. She'd always been that way, quiet as snowfall, never seen at dances, never one to meet a man's gaze for long. Colt, the old preacher rasped, his breath shallow. She'll have no one after I'm gone. No kin left. This town, this world ain't kind to a woman alone. Colt swallowed hard. He knew the preacher's meaning before the words came. I'm asking you, son, Dawson said weakly, to marry her. Not out of love, out of mercy. To see her safe. Colt's jaw tightened. Reverend, Promise me, the old man wheezed, clutching Colt's hand with surprising strength. You owe me this one kindness. There was no arguing with a dying man, least of all one who'd carried your soul on his prayers. Colt bowed his head. You have my word. 2 days later, the wedding was held in the small white church by the river. Only a handful of folks attended. Doc Harper, the blacksmith, and his wife, and a few curious townsfolk who came for gossip more than blessing. Clara stood trembling before the altar, a pale figure in a simple cotton dress. She could barely meet Colt's eyes as the preacher's apprentice read the vows. When it came time to kiss the bride, Colt simply tipped his hat and nodded. A murmur rippled through the room. It was done. That night, Colt brought her home to his ranch just beyond the cottonwoods. It was a modest spread, sturdy but cold, built for one man and a horse, not a husband and wife. He carried her small trunk inside, set it by the hearth, and stood awkwardly by the door. You can take the big room, he said, voice even but distant. I'll bunk in the back. You'll have what you need, food, money, protection. That's what I promised your pa. Clara looked up, her eyes wide and glimmering in the firelight. Thank you, Mr. Maddox. Her voice was soft as wind through wheat. It's sheriff in town, he muttered, and Colt will do here. He turned and left her standing there alone amid the quiet crackle of the fire. In the days that followed, they lived like two strangers under one roof. Clara moved softly through the house, tending to chores with a care that spoke of a heart raised to serve. She cooked his meals, mended his shirts, and kept the place clean. But she never intruded. When he left at dawn for his rounds, she packed him a tin of coffee and biscuits. When he returned at dusk, she'd have supper waiting, though she'd already eaten alone. At first, Colt hardly noticed her presence. He told himself this was duty, plain and simple. He was a lawman fulfilling a promise, nothing more. But something in him began to shift, slow and unbidden like spring thawing old frost. One evening he returned home to find her humming by the window, sewing by lamplight. It was a tune he hadn't heard since boyhood, a hymn his mother used to sing before the war. The sound of it stopped him cold. For the first time in years, the walls of his loneliness cracked. Still, he said nothing. The town whispered, of course. Red Creek was small, and gossip was its lifeblood. The saloon girls snickered that the sheriff had been snared by pity. The storekeeper's wife said Clara Maddox would never bear children. Too timid, too frail. Colt ignored it all. But each word stung her, though she never showed it. One night, a storm rolled across the plains. Thunder boomed like cannon fire, rain slashing against the windows. Colt lay awake in his narrow bed listening to the wind. Then he heard it, a soft cry from the next room. He rose, crossed the hallway, and opened the door. Clara sat upright in bed, trembling. Lightning flashed, illuminating her pale face. Sorry, she whispered. Storms frighten me. Always have. For a moment, Colt stood silent. Then he stepped forward and lit her lamp. "Ain't nothing to fear," he said quietly. "Just wind and thunder." She looked at him, then really looked. "You're kind to me," she said softly, "even if you don't mean to be." Something in his chest ached at that. He nodded once, turned to leave, then hesitated. "Get some rest, Mrs. Maddox," he said, his voice low. "I'll be right here if you need." He closed the door, but the image of her, small, fragile, yet brimming with quiet courage, stayed with him long after the storm passed. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, gold over the wet prairie. Colt saddled his horse, glancing back at the house. She stood at the doorway, her hands folded, a shy smile ghosting her lips. In that moment, Colt realized something that unsettled him more than any outlaw's bullet. He didn't just pity her anymore. He felt something dangerous. It wasn't love yet, not the kind that burns, but it was the spark that would soon set fire to everything. He thought he was. The marriage no man wanted was, slowly becoming the one thing Colt Maddox could no longer live without. Weeks turned to months in the small Montana town of Red Creek. And though Sheriff Colt Maddox carried himself the same as always, tight-lipped, steady-eyed and hard as saddle leather, something about him had begun to change. The folks didn't notice at first, but the gossip didn't stop. Red Creek was the kind of place that fed on rumor the way coyotes feed on carcasses. At the Silver Spur Saloon, men laughed that the sheriff had gone and shackled himself to a ghost. "She don't even speak half the time," sneered one ranch hand, spitting tobacco into the sawdust. "I heard she still sleeps in the preacher's shawl." Colt's deputy, Eli Booker, would snarl when he heard it. "You talk too much for a man who can't handle his liquor," he'd growl, but the damage was done. The town had decided the sheriff's wife was a timid little thing unworthy of notice, and that Colt Maddox, once the terror of every outlaw in the territory, had gone soft. But if anyone had looked closer, they'd have seen what Colt himself was beginning to see. Clara Maddox was changing. Her shyness was still there like a delicate veil, but beneath it something stronger was blooming. She had taken to keeping the ranch in perfect order, feeding the livestock, mending fences, and cooking with quiet pride. She spoke gently but with purpose, and though Colt tried not to notice, he couldn't help it. There were mornings when she'd come out to the porch with his coffee, her hair loose in the early light, and something in his chest would tighten like a drawn gun string. He'd nod his thanks, mount his horse, and ride off before the thought of her smile could do more damage. Still, Red Creek was no place for peace to linger. Trouble always found its way back, same as a snake finds its hole. One chill evening in late October, a telegraph arrived at the sheriff's office. It was short and grim. Jeb Malone and gang spotted near Bitterroot Canyon. 5 men, armed, heading east. Colt's jaw hardened. Jeb Copper Eye Malone, a name out of hell itself. The outlaw had earned his nickname from the patch of burned skin around his left eye, a mark Colt himself had given him 3 years ago during a gunfight in Blackwater Gulch. Colt had hauled him to the gallows in Helena, but Malone had escaped before the rope met his neck. Now he was coming back, and Colt knew damn well why. That night, Colt returned home late, boots heavy with dust, mind storming with old memories. Clara was still awake, sitting by the fire embroidering one of his shirts. She looked up as he entered, reading his mood instantly. "Trouble?" she asked softly. He hesitated, unbuckling his gun belt. "Could be. A man I once put away's riding these parts again. Mean bastard named Malone." Her fingers paused. "Will he come here?" "Not if I can stop him." He poured himself coffee, black and bitter. "He's got a score to settle with me. That's all." Clara studied him quietly, the firelight painting his face in shades of gold and shadow. "It's never just you, Colt," she said after a moment. "When men like that come, they take everything they can. You should be careful." Her words were soft, but they hit him like a bullet. Colt turned toward her, brow furrowed. "You don't know what kind of man I was, Clara. I've done things that would freeze your blood." "You shouldn't. I know what kind of man you are." She interrupted gently. "The kind who keeps his word. The kind who rides toward danger, not away from it. And the kind who don't realize how much that scares the people who care about him." He stared at her, silent. The room was so still he could hear the wind whispering through the cottonwoods outside. Then he nodded once, rough and quick. "Get some sleep," he said. "We'll talk no more on it." But that night, long after she'd gone to bed, Colt sat awake by the dying fire, the words echoing in his mind. the people who care about him. The next few days brought tension to Red Creek. Riders came in from nearby ranches reporting Malone's men in the hills, watching the trails. Colt doubled the patrols and sent word to the U.S. Marshal's office, though he doubted they'd send help quick enough. By the fourth night, he hadn't slept in 2 days. He came home bone-tired and dusty, his sleeve torn from a scrape with a rustler. Clara met him at the door, eyes widening at the blood on his arm. "You're hurt," she gasped, reaching for him. "It's nothing," he muttered. "Just a graze." But she was already fetching water, her hands moving with steady purpose. He tried to protest, but she silenced him with a look he'd never seen in her before, firm, determined, almost fierce. "Sit," she said. He did. She cleaned the wound with gentle hands, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she wrapped the bandage, her fingers brushed his skin, warm, trembling, alive. He looked at her, really looked, and something inside him cracked open. Her lashes lifted, meeting his gaze. For the first time, she didn't look away. The moment stretched between them, charged and fragile as a drawn bow. Then she whispered, "You can't keep carrying this alone." "Colt, you don't have to." He wanted to speak, to tell her she was wrong, that a man like him carried his burdens till the grave, but his throat tightened. Instead, he said the only truth he could manage. "You don't know what you're saying, Clara. I ain't made for tenderness." Her voice was a whisper. "Maybe it's time you learned." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping the floor. "I gotta get some rest," he said hoarsely, heading for the door. But when he stepped out into the night air, he realized his hands were shaking. The next morning, Colt saddled his horse before dawn. Clara followed him out, wrapped in a shawl against the cold. The horizon was streaked with the first hint of sunrise. "You're going after them, aren't you?" she asked. He nodded. "Can't wait for him to bring the fight here. I'll meet him in the canyon." She stepped closer, holding out his coat. "Take this. It'll be cold in the hills." He took it, their fingers brushing. The touch was small, accidental, but it lingered. Her eyes met his, shy but shining. "Be careful," she said softly. It was the gentlest thing anyone had said to him in years. He hesitated, then reached out, meaning only to tip his hat, but his hand found her cheek instead. For a heartbeat, they were frozen there, the world holding its breath. Then he bent his head and their lips met. The kiss was hesitant at first, then fierce. It tasted of morning air and quiet years lost. When they parted, both were breathless, eyes wide with something neither could name. "Clara," he whispered. She smiled faintly. "Come back to me, Colt Maddox. Don't make me a widow before I've had the chance to be a wife." He mounted his horse without another word, his heart hammering like a war drum. As he rode toward Bitterroot Canyon, the rising sun at his back, the memory of her kiss burned through him, hotter than whiskey, stronger than fear. For the first time in his life, Sheriff Colt Maddox wasn't just fighting for duty or for justice, he was fighting for her. The morning Colt Maddox rode out for Bitterroot Canyon, the sun hadn't yet climbed above the ridgeline. The air was sharp with frost, the sky pale and bruised with dawn. His horse's hooves struck the earth like the ticking of a clock, counting down to something inevitable. He rode with the wind on his face and Clara's kiss still burning on his lips, a memory that wouldn't fade no matter how many miles passed beneath him. He wasn't a man accustomed to tenderness. For years he'd built walls around his soul, tall and mean as the canyon cliffs, but that single kiss, soft, uncertain, real, had blown a hole clean through those walls. It had been like catching lightning in bare hands. He'd tasted her fear, her courage, her trust, and damn if it didn't make him feel alive again. Still, he forced the thought down. There was no room for sentiment where he was headed. Not when Jeb Copper Eye Malone and his gang were out there, 5 men who'd crawled out of hell for vengeance. Colt reached the canyon by noon. The land opened into a bowl of rock and shadow, the Bitterroot River winding through the heart of it like a dark vein. He dismounted, crouching behind a ledge, scanning the trail through his spyglass. He didn't have to wait long. 5 riders emerged from the South Pass, dusty, rough-looking, mean. Malone rode at the front, a tall figure in a black duster. The left side of his face burned raw around that molten copper eye. Even from a distance, Colt could see the cruel smile twisting his lips. "Well, you bastard," Colt muttered under his breath. "You came just like I figured." He eased back the hammer of his Winchester and waited. When the outlaws reached the center of the canyon, he opened fire. The echo of that first shot rolled like thunder across the stone. One man dropped from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. The others dove for cover, guns barking in reply. Colt moved like a shadow, firing from rock to rock. Years of law-keeping had made him a ghost on the battlefield. But Malone was no fool. He shouted orders, his voice echoing through the gorge. Fan out. The sheriff's mine, dead or breathing. Colt took down another man before a bullet grazed his shoulder, spinning him sideways. He gritted his teeth, rolled, and fired back. The smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air. He'd have finished the job right there if a sudden storm hadn't rolled in, dark clouds swallowing the canyon in shadow. The rain came hard and fast, turning the rocks slick. Colt cursed under his breath. He was running low on ammunition. When the next lightning flash split the sky, Malone was gone. By the time Colt made it back to Red Creek, night had fallen, and blood had soaked through his shirt. He rode straight for the small ranch, bone-tired and half delirious from loss of blood. The front door opened before he reached it. Clara stood in the doorway, her nightgown fluttering in the cold wind. Her eyes widened when she saw him swaying in the saddle. "Colt," she cried, rushing forward. He tried to speak but slid from the horse before he could manage a word. She caught him as best she could, her hands slipping under his arms as he collapsed into her. The weight of him nearly brought her down, but she held firm. "Lord, help me," she whispered, dragging him inside. She tore open his shirt, revealing the bullet graze across his ribs. It wasn't deep, but the blood loss had drained him near senseless. She cleaned the wound, her hands trembling but steady. The moment her fingers touched his skin, he groaned and tried to push her away. "Leave it," he rasped. "Just a scratch." "Hush," she said, eyes fierce. "Let me do this." He stared at her. This woman who had once flinched at every loud sound, who'd barely spoken above a whisper, and saw something different now. Her voice carried steel. Her hands were sure. The shy preacher's daughter was gone, replaced by someone stronger, braver, born of fire and fear and love. "You got more fight in you than half the men in this town," he muttered. She gave him a quick, trembling smile. "You just rest, Sheriff." He did as she said, letting exhaustion take him. When he woke hours later, the lamp still burned low. The storm outside had passed. Clara sat beside the bed, head resting on her arms, asleep. Strands of her hair fell loose over her face. Colt watched her for a long time. Something inside him, something he'd thought long dead, stirred. He reached out and brushed a lock of hair from her cheek. She stirred, lifting her head. "You should be resting," she whispered, voice thick with sleep. "I ain't the one who's been keeping watch all night," he said softly. She smiled faintly. "Couldn't sleep. Not till I knew you'd be all right." He sat up slowly, grimacing at the pull in his side. "Clara, about before I left?" Her eyes met his, uncertain. "The kiss?" He nodded, his throat dry. "Didn't mean to. Well, maybe I did. I ain't sure. She reached for his hand. "You don't have to explain, Colt, I knew." He stared at her, the silence stretching between them until it became something holy. Then he leaned forward, closing the distance. Their lips met again, this time without hesitation. The world outside melted away. There was only the crackle of the dying fire, the soft sigh of her breath, the steady beat of two hearts that had been too long alone. When they parted, her eyes were bright. "I thought you'd never look at me that way," she whispered. "Reckon I've been blind my whole damn life," he said. "But not anymore." In the days that followed, the ranch became their refuge. Colt's wound healed slowly under her care. Each day Clara grew bolder, laughing softly, teasing him when he grumbled. And each night, when the sun fell and the prairie went still, they'd sit by the fire in quiet companionship. Sometimes she'd hum a hymn from her father's church and he'd close his eyes, letting her voice carry him somewhere peaceful. But peace never lasted long in Red Creek. Word came from Deputy Booker that Malone's gang wasn't done. They'd raided a freight wagon near the canyon and were moving east, straight toward the Maddox Ranch. Colt felt his blood run cold. He was still half-healed, barely fit to ride, but he couldn't let them bring that fight home. When he told Clara, she shook her head fiercely. "You can't go out there alone again. Let the marshals handle it. They won't get here in time," he said. "This is my mess to clean up." "Then it's ours," she said quietly. Her words hit him like a hammer. He saw then that she wasn't afraid anymore. She wouldn't sit and hide while danger came knocking. She'd already chosen her side, and it was his. "Clara," he said, his voice rough, "if anything happens—" She stepped close, cutting him off with a finger to his lips. "No if, Colt Maddox. You'll come back to me again." He wanted to believe her. He kissed her once more, slow and deep, memorizing the feel of her, and as the horizon flared with lightning in the distance, he saddled his horse again. The wind was rising, carrying the scent of smoke and rain. He glanced back once to see Clara standing on the porch, her hand clutching his coat to her chest. That image stayed with him as he rode out. Her courage, her love, her strength. It burned in his blood, brighter than fear, sharper than pain. The kiss they had shared wasn't just love's beginning. It was the spark that would ignite everything to come. The wind came first, hard and dry, carrying the scent of smoke, the kind that told of trouble brewing out past the ridge. Sheriff Colt Maddox felt it before he saw it, the way a man feels a storm in his bones. By dusk, the prairie sky was blood red, and the wind moaned low through the cottonwoods like a warning. He stood on the porch of his small ranch, Colt in hand, eyes on the far horizon. His horse pawed at the dirt restlessly. The world had gone too still. He knew what that meant. Malone was coming. Inside the house, Clara was setting out supper, but her movements were slow, distracted. She kept glancing through the window at the gathering dark. She could read the silence in her husband's stance, the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept checking his rifle like a man who knew the night might be his last. She opened the door. "They're coming, aren't they?" Colt didn't turn. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Reckon it's time." She stepped beside him, the lamplight spilling out onto the porch. "Then I'll stay with you." He shook his head. "No, ma'am. You'll take the cellar key, bolt yourself in, and don't come out till I say." Her chin lifted. "I won't hide while they burn down what's ours." Colt turned then, his gaze meeting hers. "Clara, listen to me." "I listened when you told me to marry you," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "I listened when you said not to expect love, and I stayed. But I won't listen now. This is my home too." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. He saw it in her eyes, the fear, the strength, the fire he'd once mistaken for fragility. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, Mrs. Maddox," he said, holstering his Colt. "If you're staying, we do this together." By midnight, the gang arrived. 5 riders tore through the darkness, torches flaring in their hands, the sound of their horses like thunder on dry earth. Jeb Copper-Eye Malone rode at the front, his black coat whipping in the wind that burned, twisted grin splitting his face. "Sheriff," he bellowed, his voice echoing across the plain, "come out and meet your judgment." Colt answered with a single rifle shot that took Malone's hat clean off his head. The outlaw laughed, torchlight dancing in his good eye. "You always did have fine aim, Maddox. But tonight ain't about bullets, it's about burning your life to the ground." He hurled his torch onto the porch. Flames leapt like hungry wolves, licking the wooden posts. "Colt," Clara cried from inside. "Back door now," he shouted, kicking through the doorway. Smoke rolled thick through the house, black and choking. He grabbed a bucket from the pump, dousing the walls, but it was too late. The dry timber caught like paper. "Go!" he barked, shoving Clara toward the rear exit. She stumbled out, coughing, clutching the small revolver he'd given her weeks before. Colt burst out behind her, rifle in hand, firing into the night. The first shot dropped one of Malone's men. The second shattered another's lantern, plunging half the yard into darkness. The gang returned fire, bullets whining through the air. One struck the corral post near Clara, splintering it to dust. She ducked behind the rain barrels, heart hammering. Colt moved like a machine, calm, deadly, his long duster swirling around him as he reloaded. But they were outnumbered. Malone's laughter cut through the gunfire. "You think you can save her, lawman? You took my life once, now I'll take yours slow." He spurred his horse forward, firing wild. Colt dove behind the well, a bullet grazing his hat brim. He returned fire, but Malone ducked behind his horse. Circling like a wolf, meanwhile, one of the bandits broke away and crept toward the house, toward Clara. She saw his shadow moving through the smoke, long knife glinting. Her hands trembled as she raised the revolver. The bandit stepped into view, grinning. "Pretty thing. Let's see if you scream like your man bleeds." Clara's fear melted in an instant. She aimed for his chest and fired. The sound was deafening. The man jerked backward, eyes wide, before crumpling to the dirt. Clara stood frozen, smoke curling around her. The gun fell from her hand, but her heart burned fierce. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply turned toward the fight and raised her chin. Colt saw it happen and felt something deep inside him roar with pride and terror all at once. He caught Malone in his sights and pulled the trigger. The bullet struck the outlaw's shoulder, spinning him off his horse. Malone hit the ground hard, snarling like an animal. "You ain't killing me that easy, Sheriff," he spat, fumbling for his pistol. Before he could raise it, Clara stepped from behind the barrels, smoke swirling around her like a ghost. Her dress was torn, soot streaked her face, but her eyes were steady as the moon. "Drop it," she said. Malone laughed, low and cruel. "You ain't got the nerve, girl." She raised the revolver again. "I had enough nerve to marry a man like him." The shot rang out. Malone fell backward, the gun flying from his hand. His eyes stared up at the burning sky, the copper gleam of his scar catching the firelight one last time before going still. Silence followed, long, heavy, broken only by the crackle of flames devouring the Maddox home. Colt limped forward, dropping to one knee beside Clara. "You all right?" She nodded, shaking, tears streaking through the soot. I killed him." He took her hands, bloodied and trembling, and pressed them to his chest. "You saved us, Clara, saved me." The fire roared higher behind them, swallowing the roof. Colt stood, pulling her close as sparks flew around them. The heat was unbearable, the light blinding. But in that inferno they found each other, two broken souls standing against the ruin of everything they'd known. He kissed her there, amid the smoke and ashes, tasting salt and fire. It wasn't gentle, it was desperate, raw, the kind of kiss that meant survival. When they finally broke apart, the house collapsed in on itself with a thunderous crash. "Let it burn," Colt murmured, holding her close. "We'll start again." By dawn, the fire had died. The prairie lay quiet beneath a sky streaked pink and gold. The Maddox ranch was nothing but charred timber and ash. But the worst was over. Deputy Booker rode in with a posse from town, their faces grim when they saw the wreckage. "Jesus, Sheriff," Booker said, dismounting. "Heard the gunfire all the way to the spur. You all right?" Colt nodded slowly. "We are now." He looked at Clara, who stood beside him wrapped in his coat, hair tangled, face smudged, but eyes shining bright as morning. Booker tipped his hat to her. "Heard tell the shy preacher's daughter put a bullet in Malone herself." Clara flushed, but she didn't look away. "He left me no choice," Booker chuckled. "Reckon the good Lord gave you a steady hand, ma'am." Colt's arm slipped around her waist. "And a brave heart," he said quietly. The men began clearing the bodies, the smoke rising into the clear blue. Colt and Clara stood hand in hand, watching as the ruins of their old life smoldered down to gray. The land was still. The danger had passed, but something new, something stronger had been born out of that night's fire. Love, not born of soft words or promises, but of blood, courage, and survival. And as the wind carried away the last of the smoke, Sheriff Colt Maddox knew he'd never be the same man again. He had walked through hell and found heaven standing beside him, wearing a torn dress and holding a smoking gun. The sun rose slow and proud over Red Creek, spilling gold across the blackened land. Smoke still curled from the remains of the Maddox ranch, but the air was cleaner now, almost peaceful. The storm had passed, and what was left of it, ashes, silence, and the faint smell of gunpowder, was the price they'd paid for survival. Sheriff Colt Maddox stood by the corral fence, hat in hand, his shadow long against the morning dust. He hadn't slept. The night's fight still replayed in his mind, the flames, the gunshots, Clara's voice cutting through the chaos. He'd seen men fight and he'd seen them die, but he'd never seen courage like hers. Behind him, the door of the small barn creaked open. Clara stepped out, wrapped in a wool blanket, hair tousled, eyes soft but alive with a light he hadn't seen before. She looked at the ruins of their home, at the black skeleton of what had been their start, and then at him. "You've been standing there since dawn," she said gently. "Couldn't sleep," he answered without turning. "Too quiet." She came to stand beside him. "You ain't used to quiet." He chuckled faintly. "Not this kind. Feels like it's waiting for something." She tilted her head. "Maybe it's waiting for us to decide what comes next." He looked at her then. Really looked. At the soot that still streaked her cheek. The small cut near her lip. The weariness in her stance. Yet there was no fear left in her. She stood tall, steady, proud. "You ever think," he said quietly, "that maybe God knew what he was doing when he tied two souls together, even when one of them didn't want the rope?" She smiled faintly. "You saying you're glad you were forced to marry me, Sheriff?" He met her gaze, and for the first time since the night they wed, he smiled without sadness behind it. "Reckon I am." By midday, the townsfolk began to arrive. Riders from Red Creek, curious and solemn. They came to see what had become of the sheriff's home, and word spread quick that Jeb Malone and his gang were gone for good. Old Hank Dobbs, the blacksmith, shook Colt's hand hard. "Town owes you more than we can say, Sheriff. Heard you and the missus fought him off alone." Colt shrugged. "Wasn't just me." Clara stood her ground, same as any lawman. The crowd turned to look at her then, the quiet preacher's daughter who used to walk with her eyes downcast and speak in whispers. Now she stood before them in the open daylight, chin lifted, calm and sure. "I did what needed doing," she said simply. The murmur that followed was full of respect. Even old Hank's wife dabbed at her eyes with her apron. Colt rested his hand at the small of her back. "Reckon we'll rebuild," he said to the crowd. "This land's been through fire before. Always comes back stronger." The men nodded, tipping their hats. One by one, they offered help: lumber, nails, horses, food. It was how folks survived out there, together. As the crowd dispersed, Clara turned to Colt. "You told him we'd rebuild. You really mean to stay?" He nodded slowly. "I've been running my whole life, Clara. From duty, from love, from myself. But this is where I stop." She stepped closer, her hand finding his. "Then we'll start fresh, together." That evening they worked side by side, clearing the rubble. The sun sank low, casting long amber light over the land. Every board they lifted, every shovelful of ash they moved, felt like laying the first stones of a new life. At one point, Colt found a half-burned picture frame buried in the ashes. Their wedding photograph. The edges were charred, the image faded, but their faces were still visible. Him in his black coat, her in white, eyes shy and uncertain. He held it for a long time before passing it to her. "Guess even fire couldn't burn this away," he murmured. She traced the edge with her fingers, then looked up. "Maybe it burned off what wasn't real. Left what mattered." Colt smiled, a tired, honest smile. "You always see the truth clearer than me." "That's 'cause I ain't afraid to look," she said softly. Days turned to weeks. The ranch rose again, slowly, stubbornly, plank by plank. The people of Red Creek came to help, bringing meals, tools, and laughter. The sound of hammers echoed across the valley like music. Clara tended to the small garden she planted by the well, and every morning she brought Colt coffee before he rode into town for duty. The town had changed toward her, too. Women stopped her in the street to ask after the sheriff. Men tipped their hats with respect. The shy woman was no longer seen as timid but strong, and Colt, he found something he'd lost long ago: peace. He wasn't just a gun hand anymore or a man carrying ghosts. He was a husband, a protector, and finally, a man with roots. Sometimes at dusk, he'd sit on the new porch with Clara, watching the sun bleed down over the hills. The cicadas would hum and the wind would play soft through the cottonwoods. He'd take her hand then, thumb tracing her palm, and say, "You know, I used to think love was for men with no scars, for folks who hadn't seen what I've seen." She'd lean her head on his shoulder. "Maybe love's for the ones who have seen it, Colt, 'cause they know how rare it is." He'd smile at that, small, thoughtful. "You talk prettier than a preacher." "And you kiss better than a sinner," she'd tease. He'd laugh then, a real laugh, full and low, and kiss her until the stars came out. One night, months after the fire, a storm rolled in from the north, hard rain, booming thunder. But instead of fear, the sound brought comfort. The fields drank deep and the roof they'd built held strong. As lightning lit the plains, Clara lay beside Colt, her hand resting on his chest. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked quietly. He turned to her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Every day. You regret it?" He shook his head. "Not one damn bit. It took blood and fire to show me what I'd been blind to." She smiled softly. "And what's that?" "That the shyest woman in town's got more courage than any man I ever rode with. And that I'd go through hell again just to find her." Her eyes shone in the flicker of lightning. "You didn't find me, Colt. You finally saw me." He kissed her then, slow and deep, and outside the storm raged on, washing away the ashes of the past. When the rains passed, the land around Red Creek bloomed green again. Wildflowers rose where the fire had burned. The creek, once dry, sang with water, and on a clear spring morning a wagon from town rattled up the hill. Booker climbed down, grinning wide. Got something for you two, he said, handing Colt a folded paper. What's this? Territorial papers, Booker said proudly. Governor signed them himself. Maddox Ranch is officially part of Red Creek County. Your land's legal and yours for good. Colt turned the papers in his hand, then looked at Clara. She was smiling, sunlight glinting in her hair. Ours for good, he repeated. She nodded, eyes bright. Then let's make it worth keepin'. He pulled her close and kissed her right there in the yard as the wind danced through the grass. That evening, when the sun dipped low, Clara stood on the porch, watching Colt ride back from town. His silhouette moved against the glowing horizon, steady, strong, the man she'd once feared and now loved beyond reason. He dismounted, tipping his hat with that faint, familiar smirk. "Evening, Mrs. Maddox, evening, Sheriff," she said, smiling. He climbed the steps, took her hand, and turned her toward the sunset. "See that?" he murmured. "Sky's on fire again." She leaned into him. "Don't matter. We've already learned how to survive the burn." He kissed her softly as the sky flamed red and gold over Red Creek, the air full of promise. For the first time, the fire didn't mean destruction. It meant life. It meant love reborn. And under that endless western sky, Sheriff Colt Maddox and his once-shy bride stood together, strong, unbroken, and finally home.